Hello and welcome to our audience members joining us from across the globe. I'm Raymond Karam, the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. I want to wish a Ramadan Kareem to all our friends and audience members who are fasting during this holy month of Ramadan. We're glad to be hosting this discussion today, looking at the new founding day in Saudi Arabia and the transformation of Saudi society. We have an excellent panel of experts with us. I'll introduce them briefly here and share a link to their full bios in the chat. First is Sultan Al-Amir, a political science doctoral student at the George Washington University. His research interests include the origins of ethnic and sectarian identities in the Middle East, state formation, legislative institutions in Gulf monarchies, contemporary Arab and Muslim political philosophy, and political violence. He is a co-founder and a member of the executive committee of the Arab Political Science Network and the editor-in-chief of criticism and essays for the Arabic digital platform Awad-Kosh. He is widely published in outlets including AGSIW, and I would recommend to you his piece written on today's topic, which I will share with you in the chat shortly. Also with us is Eman Alhussein, a non-resident fellow at AGSIW. She previously worked as a research fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies in Riyadh. Her research focuses on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. Her areas of interest include identity and nationalism, gender, cultural and societal change, and religious discourse and reforms. I will also share a relevant piece from Eman published on our website looking at Saudi Arabia and the championing of modern Islam, and I will put that link in the chat with you as well. Last but not least is Hassan, the founder and editor-in-chief of New Lines magazine, an initiative of the New Lines Institute. Previously, he was a senior fellow at the Program on Extremism at George Washington University and the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. He has also been an associate fellow at Chatham House Middle East and North Africa Program and a research associate at the Dalma Institute in the UAE. He has written extensively on Sunni and Shia movements, society and politics in the Middle East for numerous publications. And he has also published an excellent piece related to today's topic, and I will share that link with you too from New Lines magazine. And moderating the session today is Kristin Diwan, Senior Resident Scholar at AGSIW. Her current projects concern generational change, nationalism, and the evolution of Islamism in the countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Her analysis of Gulf affairs has appeared in many publications. She was previously an assistant professor at the American University School of International Service and has held visiting scholar positions at the George Washington University and Georgetown University. And with that, Kristin, over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Raymond, for the kind introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be here with this great panel. As you see, all of the scholars and analysts joining us today have been writing specifically on this topic, and it's a particularly important one, looking at the new Saudi founding day and its implications for the much broader changes that are happening inside of Saudi Arabia. We at the Institute have a special kind of project this year. We're always taking a close look at Saudi Arabia, but this year in particular, we're trying to really take a deeper dive, feeling that now, we're many years into the reign of King Salman, and even 5 years into Mohammed bin Salman being the crown prince and kind of leading the direction of the changing state. And it's very clear now to see much more kind of structure and bones to this changing Saudi Arabia. So we're hoping to really take a deeper dive and look at what those structures are and what it tells us about this direction that Saudi Arabia is taking. So I'm really excited to be having this panel, which looks at this very particular day that I think it kind of brings into sharp relief this pivotal shift that's happened in the ideological formations and the political kind of basis of the state in Saudi Arabia. So as we all know, on January 27th of this year, King Salman bin Abdulaziz issued a royal decree designating February 22nd as a national holiday, a new national holiday called the Founding Day, which was set to commemorate the beginning of the reign of Mohammed ibn Saud and his foundation of the first Saudi state. The day was marked by a lot of celebrations that we're all getting more used to in this new Saudi Arabia. Leading up to the day, Saudi social and traditional media was replete with articles explaining the significance of this day. It was promoted with a new logo, There were lots of festivities that were held, including popular gatherings in which Saudis were encouraged to wear regional costumes. But much more than this, though, I think the day marks a lot more than just this national celebration, which it definitely was a day of celebration, because it marks really a break with the established historical narrative that has guided the kingdom since its origins. And as one of our panelists, Sultan Al-Amr, has put it, it pretty much represents the origination of a new political myth for the kingdom, and we'll talk about what that means, and presumably a new political foundation for the state. So as I said, we've gathered a great group of scholars to look at this change, to think about the significance of Founding Day and the overall context then of this erosion of the place of what it marks in terms of the erosion of the place of the Wahhabi religious trend and its political establishment within the kingdom. And so let's just dive right in then and start to get into this topic. Sultan, maybe we can start with you because you wrote this piece specifically, right when the Founding Day was being celebrated, explaining what was so important about it. So can you tell us from your perspective, what is the Saudi Founding Day and what is politically significant about it?
Thank you, Kristin, for having me. So I would say that Saudi Arabia has already a national day, which is September 23rd. And this date, the September 23rd, commemorates the unification of the two kingdoms of Hijaz and Najd into one kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. So the decision of announcing a new holiday and called the Foundation Day has a certain functions and has a significant political relevance. And I will elaborate that by showing how the Saudi state was telling its history before this announcement, and then before that that the standard narrative for the Saudi state, the narrative that is used as a political myth in order to legitimize the political project, it's normally told as starting from the year 1744, when the founder of the Wahhabi movement, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab, came to a town in southern Najd called Dir'iyah, which was ruled by Muhammad bin Saud, who is the great-grandfather of King Salman. And the two made some kind of a covenant or a deal or a contract where the Saudi ruler of the town will support Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and his protect his religious teaching and commit to split them in Arabia and outside of Arabia. And from this historical narrative, we see several things. First, that the Saudi state is legitimized as being a necessary tool for spreading and protecting and promoting the Wahhabism. And we see here Wahhabism is the main object there. And the main aspect of Wahhabism is religious monotheism, which is in Arabic called Tawheed. And this term is important because it will be used in the new political myth, but in a different connotation. And this story has been told since King Abdulaziz, and up until 2011, King Salman, when he was governor of Riyadh, made a famous lecture at the Islamic University in Medina. It's called The Intellectual Origins of the Saudi State, and he also reiterate the same narrative that this is how the Saudi state started and how it is legitimized and how it is a relationship with Wahhabis. The new political myth that was announced by Founding Day, it didn't choose the year 1744. It started with 1727, so it pushed the starting date of the Saudi state a few years before. And this shift is highly significant because it does two things. First, it started the history of the Saudi state from the beginning of Muhammad bin Saud rule. And by doing this, it eliminates or erases the existence and the rule and the importance of Muhammad Abdul Wahhab and its contribution to the foundation of the Saudi state. And the second, it also makes the Saudi state, instead of being a necessary tool for spreading Wahhabism, and turn it into an aim of itself. So the attempts from this date and up until King Abdulaziz unification of contemporary Saudi Arabia is told as a story of consecutive attempts by Saudi rulers and family members who attempted to unify Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula in general. So, and the term unification in English and the term monotheism in the religious term monotheism, both in Arabic has the same meaning. It's called Tawheed. So what we see is a movement from religious Tawheed into a more political Tawheed, and making the Saudi state is an aim of itself. And this and this shift also meant first that religion in general and Wahhabism in particular now plays a minor or insignificant role in the new story of the Saudi state. Second, it makes the state as an aim of itself, and makes the project of founding this state is an effort by the Saudi royal family without involving any kind of partners. Where in the past, in the Wahhabi political narrative, we see there is a partnership between the religious establishment and the Saudi royal family. And third, this new story also, if we want to compare it with the Wahhabi one, it is more socially inclusive than the Wahhabi one, because it accepts the social and sectarian diversity in Saudi Arabia, and also celebrates them. Whereas in terms of politics, it is more politically exclusive in terms of that the only actors that matter and have legitimacy and are the Saudi royal family who have no partners at all, and that limit and exclude any kind of potential political opening into. I might say more about this, but this is how I see the shift in terms of its political significance in this period.
We'll definitely hold those last two thoughts, because we'll want to get into that more, like the real significance of what it means for the Saudi state and the kind of changes. But I wanted to put it within a broader context, because as you're saying, I mean, this is really notable. I think even those of us as scholars or political scientists who come in and studying Saudi Arabia, this is the first kind of thing that we learn about Saudi Arabia, that the Saudi state is formed of this pact that was made in this religious movement from this time, between this religious leader and the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the political leadership who formed this pact that then goes on to form these successive, Saudi states. So I just want to underline, from your long narrative, that really what we're seeing here is a complete shift. Now the Saudi state is saying, no, this isn't the origins of the Saudi state. The Saudi state comes even earlier than that. And it's really in the origins of this political leader who is now grounding the leadership of the state. So clearly then we're seeing sort of, again, this idea of a sort of a break or a lowering of the significance of the political relevance of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and Wahhabism in the state. I mean, that's pretty clear pretty much from this shift. But you've written as well that, this isn't the only place where we see this, right? I mean, this is kind of the most notable in that it's really, put in this day, this very, day that's set out as the founding day of the state. But we're seeing a lot of other indicators of this political shift in the kingdom, right? You mentioned in your article history books that no longer, new history books don't even mention Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Of course, things that we're all noting about the crippling of the religious police and, the ability of them to enforce sort of the standards that are set by that, the replacement of that with a more secular, that Eman has written about, public decency law, developments within other state institutions that we're seeing, Ministry of Islamic Affairs, Council of Senior Scholars, Ministry of Education, new changes that are happening in the judiciary. So this is of a piece of a lot of other changes that we see happening in the kingdom. So I want to just ask you why you think we're seeing this at this time. Why do we see all these big, broader changes happening?
So normally when governments and countries, so the changing a historical narrative in a country or a state is something not exclusive to Saudi Arabia. It's been happening around the region and globally. And I think there are several explanations that's been suggested. One of them is that it's a top-down approach by a new leadership that has a new political agenda. But I think that a closer look to what happened in Saudi Arabia since the the late 1990s up to 2015, there was also this was a period of some kind of a relative opening in terms of political discussions and political engagement with the Saudi politics and Saudi narratives. And in this environment, there were several movements intellectually and politically who challenged this narrative from below. And there are academics, intellectuals, and political activists who thought that this Wahhabi political myth, that the way that the Saudi state legitimizes itself, prevent any kind of transformation of the Saudi state into a more politically open and socially inclusive country. And in order to open these possibilities, these intellectuals engaged in a kind of a revisionist history of the Saudi state and providing new interpretation to what this state was about and how we understand the rise of Wahhabism and to what extent that this movement has served its purpose and that we are now in need of something else. And there were several proposals that were suggested at the time on how to go and these movements offered several alternatives. And what I see, without this intellectual work that has taken place in this period, that the possibility for having these alternatives ready and some kind have an appeal is difficult. And it's paved the way for Mohammed bin Salman and King Salman to pick one alternative of these several alternatives that were suggested in this period, and then turn it into a state doctrine. So without giving credit to this intellectual and political work that was taking place in that period, I think it is difficult to understand how such a shift could be even possible. As you said in school's book, I grew up in studying the history, Saudi history, in a way that the first chapter is about Muhammad al-Wahhab, about his biography when he was born and how he traveled and studied, etc. And then from then we go to first Saudi state and then second Saudi state and then third Saudi state. Now the history books in 2018, I think they changed it to 2019. They don't mention Muhammad ibn al-Wahhab as an important figure. I think the only mention of Muhammad al-Wahhab is in the questions by the end of one chapter, that as an example of one entrepreneur that the Saudi state adopted in amongst other who the Saudi state is. And also I want to mention that the new narrative is more ambitious than just shifting the beginning of the Saudi state, first Saudi state from 1744 to 1770. It has also some other aspects. So, for example, it started the new narrative then that was published by WAS, the Saudi public agency. It started 200 years before Islam itself. So when the tribe of Al Saud moved from outside of Najd to Najd, and then the history jumps to the 15th century, when the great grandfather of Al Saud family founded the Dir'iyah city town. And then the story of Dir'iyah is told as if in a similar way that Rome story is told, as a city state that slowly expands and include other territories from the region, as if it is distant that this town by the way that it was designed and formed to have this political manifestation by incorporating all the surrounding regions. And in telling the story in this way, the hint that the Islam itself, what was founded, it is told as a brief period of Arabian Peninsula, and then they say Islam then spread to other capitals of Iraq and Syria and Egypt, and Arabian Peninsula went back to its state that was common before Islam. It's only the Saudi family who was capable to found this regions of the Arabian Peninsula even more than and more longer and more stable than the early founders of Islam.
Mm. Well, there is a different element to this as well, that this political relevance is really key, and the centralization of the story on the also themselves is very key. But it's interesting as well to see at the same time, you know, the story centered, of course, on Daraiya as the founding city now of the state. At the same time that we're seeing Daraiya revived now as a real area, the city, area north of Riyadh, as a real center for this new development in the kingdom of a tourism capital, being sort of the new Rome of Saudi Arabia, where tourists can come and see the origins of the Saudi state, but also where you can have these sort of festivities where now, we're having concerts there, we're having wrestling, we're having auto races, concerts, all sorts of things happening in Daraiya, along with the broader commercial developments there. So I think that speaks to the centering of the news story and this new kind of developments within the kingdom. And I know, Eman, you've talked about this and written about basically some of the alternatives then of the way that the kingdom is approaching Islam through a lot of these new clerics that are being promoted and an overall positioning of moderate Islam. And you've described this moderate Islam as a comprehensive strategy to tackle the kingdom's regional and domestic concerns while reshaping the religious and social scene within the kingdom with these new socio-political objectives, which are very much centered then in this broader Vision 2030 and these economic also changes that we're seeing in the kingdom. So I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about, how you see this moderate Islam, the sort of new way that they're presenting Islam within the kingdom, the leadership, and how it fits into these other changes that we're seeing.
Thank you so much, Kristin. I'm definitely going to mention that, but I just wanted to touch upon a few points that I was that are quite interesting, and maybe Sultan has also mentioned some of them. I think it would be, or it might be useful first to mention the various attempts by the state to, over the years and even decades, to highlight Al Saud's important role in state formation. And that goes back to maybe 1950 with the Golden Jubilee that was canceled. And 15 years later, and I personally remember that in 1999, when they tried to, celebrate the 100 years since King Abdulaziz captured Riyadh. And of course, the 1950 was canceled, and the one in 1999 was a very low-key celebration. And of course, not to forget that we also have the Janadriya Festival, which is an important annual celebration to showcase the diverse social and cultural fabric of the kingdom. And of course, in 2005, when King Abdullah ascended to the throne, he announced that the National Day will become a public holiday. Why I wanted to bring these up is because, all of these examples were subject to criticism by religious scholars, whether through issuing fatwas and circulating fatwas in the case of the 1950 Golden Jubilee and in 1999 as well, or the heavy presence of the religious police during these events. And that was in Janadriya up until maybe recently, and also in 2005 onwards when the Saudis started celebrating the National Day. And of course, the different reasons for this rejection or the rejection of such events was maybe one of them, I'm sure there are plenty, but one of them was, their interest in maintaining, a religious identity first and foremost, as the overarching identity for all Saudis. And now when we talk about, 2015 onwards, what I think is very interesting is, to see the progression of all these attempts to foster some kind of nationalism over the years and decades, and how it has changed into, not once a year kind of celebration, which happens on the 23rd of September. It's an everyday event, more or less. You see it on social media, you see it in concerts, you see it in sporting events and theater and so on. And I just wanted to mention, and this is maybe one of the things Sultan talked about, is, how this took place. And I think it's very important to highlight, the critique of Sahwa that began, in my view, maybe after 9/11. And how it was, led by intellectuals and so on. And it was really a critique of different things that, you would find in newspapers, where they were talking about Al-Khususiyya Saudiya, for example. Lots of times we read that Al-Khususiyya Saudiya, or the exclusivity of Saudi Arabia, because it's the land of the holy sites, or Islam's holy sites. It's because, the significance of Islam. We're not supposed to, have cinemas where women are not supposed to do this or that, we have gender segregation and so on. So this al-khususiyya, I think, is one of the phrases that we used to hear all the time and we don't hear anymore. So it's quite interesting. So this was, I think, an organic critique of Sahwa, which
Eman, can you explain just a bit for those readers who, a lot of people are very aware of this, but when you're talking about the Sahwa, what you mean by that?
The Islamic awakening, which is now being very much under the, the microscope in the past few years. And there's, of course, a demonization of Sahwa, and not only in social media, but for those who are watching Ramadan series, we just, I'm sure some of you are aware of Al-Asuf, which is in its 3rd season, and it's an ongoing of this demonization of Sahwa, what is considered the reason for all the social and religious restrictions imposed on Saudi Arabia by the religious scholars, or those who were very active in the 1980s and 1990s. So this demonization is quite interesting because the clampdown of religious scholars in 2017, and of course, this demonization of Sahwa have really allowed for a comprehensive rewriting of recent history through television shows and celebrations of national days, such as, of course, the Founding Day and so on. And I won't be surprised if there will be more, national days like we've seen. And I think this has all been driven by a number of factors. We have, of course, the Vision 23, which is considered the cornerstone strategy for diversification. And opening up the social and opening up the social life and bringing entertainment, cultural events have all been depicted as important for the youth. And I think when we talk about the youth, it's quite important that sometimes we all have been guilty of lumping the youth in one category and talking about them as one homogeneous body. And I think even the youth are diverse, so we have to be a bit more careful about talking about the youth. And of course, this is all, part of the, breaking and dismantling of the social contract. So, you see it always emphasized constantly on social media also that the youth have to work harder and, longer than their parents. And, they have to change their expectations. You're not going to find work in the public sector. You have to look for work in the private sector. And this, I think the nationalism here is very important because it's a way to justify the kingdom's new economic direction. Going back to the point you mentioned about moderate Islam, I think it's a very interesting project that the kingdom has been working on recently. We've seen this, of course, with the Crown Prince's remarks in 2017 when he said, we will take back Saudi to moderate Islam. And I think what we've seen globally is that, the kingdom is trying to project itself still as a promoter, not only to maintain its influence or its overreach that we've seen in the past years and decades, but to replace it with moderate Islam. And one of the lead persons, or people who are behind this project, is the Secretary General of the Muslim World League, Mohammed Al-Isa, who initially focused, I think, on the outreach to religious leaders and institutions. We've seen when he visited a synagogue in Paris, I think in 2018, leading the prayers in Auschwitz and speaking to US think tanks. And then slowly, I think he changed his focus. He wanted to start, talking to the Muslims in the diaspora. I was watching his religious show, which was aired last year and the year before, and also this year, but I didn't really have time to watch this one. But he really talks a lot about integration. He talks about, Muslims in the diaspora should try to integrate in their societies. You shouldn't be worried that, you shouldn't feel like this will harm your Islamic identity and so on. And I think that's really quite interesting, because it's very much different from what we used to hear before. So, but the question is, to what extent there is a global audience? I don't know. The NBC was trying to rank their shows this Ramadan based on popularity, and they put Mohammed Al-Isa's program, Billati Hiya Ahsan, that's what it's called. They placed it at number 6. But then again, I don't know how useful and effective this outreach is. Maybe it's too early to say. And I think it would be very interesting also to mention briefly how Saudi Arabia and the UAE, they're doing this, because the UAE definitely has a very similar agenda, whereas Saudi, I think, wants to maintain its religious significance for many reasons. Because I think one of the main cornerstones of the Vision 2030 is to attract more religious tourism. So that's very important to keep that. Whereas the UAE, I think it wants to distinguish itself as a promoter of universalism. And I think this is what we've seen with hosting of the Abrahamic family house and the recent normalization with Israel, and through other cultural and art institutions that focus on universalism as its main theme. But we can talk more about the moderate Islam domestically. I'll leave it up to here, and we can touch on these points later.
Okay, you've kind of put a lot of things on the table that I think just to underline a couple of them, some of these shifts that we're seeing in the religious centering of Saudi Arabia are linked to the economic changes, obviously, and the need to have a more inclusive kind of public, and to be able to attract more people into the kingdom, to allow for those sorts of changes. And we're also seeing the centralization and the shift to nationalism then as the change sort of in the political presentation of the kingdom. That's really centered then much more on the ruling family. So I wanted to turn to you, Hassan, then and kind of look at that last point that Eman brought up about how this is perceived abroad. We know Saudi Arabia has always been very important, not just for the way that it presents itself to its own public, but as a real global leader in Islam, and the enormous changes, influence that it's had internationally. So I'm wondering, as Saudi turns to kind of emphasizing much more of the Al Saud family and Saudi nationalism, which is very much centered on the Saudi public then, and accompanied by maybe this new presentation of a moderate Islam, how you see that being picked up and perceived internationally in the things that you're observing in the broader Islamic community?
Well, I think first of all, thank you, Kristin. Great to be speaking alongside Sultan and Eman. I think so. This is an interesting question within kind of a broad set of interesting questions happening. About things happening in the region, not just related to Wahhabism, but also the groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, and one spectrum, and the other like jihadism in general. And the trend seems to be, at this point of time, there is some sort of a transition. Things are changing, and certainly the prominence and the preeminence of regimes and states and even borders. If you look at the region from Afghanistan all the way to probably the Sahel region, or borderline these areas. We've seen the consolidation of nation states and borders, and these type of ideologies that kind of go beyond borders are being challenged across the board. It's not just in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, but specifically about Wahhabism, I think more people agree than disagree about what Wahhabism is going through, that it is going through a demise of sort, a decline of sort. The definition of that demise is obviously subject to debate, but I don't think people debate the idea that at least currently Wahhabism is facing this sort of, was going through a low point. But I think, to me, the more interesting question is, like I said, globally and regionally, is this something lasting? Is it one of those moments in history or even contemporary history where we've seen some of these ideologies facing a decline, and then something happens or a set of conditions happen in the region, and then you see them rising again? In my opinion, I think Wahhabism is in decline indefinitely. I don't think we'll see a situation where ideologies like or movements like Wahhabism gaining the same outsized role that they had before. And the key point, probably to me, is that the fate of Wahhabism is no longer tied or in the hands of the Saudi state. Meaning, before, the Saudi state had sort of a kind of a switch button when it comes to Wahhabism. They could play it up or they could tone it down, depends on how convenient the movement is. But I don't think they can, whether it's Mohammed bin Salman or someone else, will be able to resurrect this movement and use it again, utilize it again, whether domestically, maybe domestically is still a subject debate, but regionally and globally, because the movement itself has been facing a set of problems for about 2 decades. Sultan makes a good job at kind of explaining what Wahhabism domestically kind of faced, especially after 9/11. That was a key event that forced the Saudis and others to kind of look Wahhabism in the face and kind of examine it and look at it and focus on the problems that Wahhabism offers. But like I said, that also happened at a time when 2 of its greatest symbols or icons of Wahhabism, Ibn Uthaymeen a decade before that, and Ibn Baz, if I'm not mistaken, probably I'm switching the thing. Also, both of them died before 9/11. And when Wahhabism started to face these problems, and then later under King Abdullah, some of the revisionism that started to happen, Wahhabism didn't have the icons or the ability, the charisma, if you like, to kind of withstand these big changes. And then the Arab Spring happened and so on and so forth. So Wahhabism, whether you're talking about from within or from without, many things happen that make Wahhabism basically very weakened and hollowed out movement. And one of the key points and strength points of strength for Wahhabism always, and I'm speaking as someone who grew up seeing Wahhabism trying to kind of gain some ground in Syria, for example, in areas like, if you think about the areas that ISIS kind of took control of in 2014, whether you're talking about Western Iraq or Central Iraq all the way to the north, and then Eastern Syria all the way to Aleppo. These areas historically were strongholds of Sufism. And to see Wahhabism or kind of Salafism in general trying to gain some ground in the 90s, and I grew up around that time, kind of came of age at that time. And I saw people, for example, coming from the Gulf region, from Kuwait, from Saudi, from other areas, building mosques or trying to build some, gain some kind of ground, whether you talk about under Saddam in Iraq or under Hafiz al-Assad in Syria. And the key appeal for Wahhabism and Salafism, like I said, has always been this simplicity of their message. So it's like in journalism, we call it the elevator pitch sort of thing. So it's a very simple sentence. What's your message? Monotheism and return to original Islam. We followed the early generation because they knew Islam best. Simple message, right? And that had a simple, very direct, very interesting appeal, powerful. And it's powerful, especially against, for Sunnis. I'm not criticizing any movement, but I'm saying for traditional Sunnis, it has an appeal against Shias, Shia Islam, or against Sufism, because especially Sufism is not theologically and doctrinally powerful when it comes to, or strong, or kind of even doesn't pay attention to this kind of more spiritual. And it makes it easy for Wahhabism, Salafism to spread. And that's why, you started to see Wahhabism kind of spreading very fast in the 80s and 90s in places like Syria and Iraq and other areas. But again, in the 90s and the 2000s, that simplicity of the message started to be challenged from within and from without. From within by the splinter or Salafist currents that came out of Salafism or came out of or were influenced by Salafism, whether we're talking about jihadism, whether we're talking about Salafi currents that emphasize loyalty to regimes and, Wali al-Amr, as they say, the ruler, or other things. And so now when you say Salafism or return to the Salaf, then the question becomes more complicated. Okay, what Salaf you're talking about? What's the earliest generation you're talking about? And who interprets that idea? So that, to me, that kind of changes the conversation for Salafism from within, and that's not going to be reversed by anybody, because now once you fragment a movement, it becomes hard for that to be utilized in the same way. Also, because of jihadism, because of extremism, it's become hard for anybody, whether Salafist clerics or regimes, to play up that idea, play up the strength of Wahhabism, whether you're talking about Tawheed, monotheism, or return to original Islam, that rigidity, authenticity, whatever, because that plays into the hands of extremists. So it becomes awkward because of extremism, and harder to claim monopoly over because of the splinter of the organization from the movement from within. And then again, to just move things fast, then a lot of different things happened, whether you're talking about the Arab Spring and really countries across the region paying more attention to extremism and extremist ideas, becoming more aware, and being more aware and more guarded often makes a big difference. And that's how that applies to a jihadist organization that at some point use power vacuum, and people not paying attention to sweep in and build roots in places in rural areas, for example, remote hinterlands across the region. That's changing across the board. Whether you're talking about Arab republics like Egypt and others, Syria and others, who became more aware of Salafist and jihadist movements and all this kind of different extremist movements, and they started to proactively work against these movements, and weaponizing different movements in their areas to also be more guarded against these organizations. But the one region that has always, just one very quickly, the one region that sort of helped Salafism for a long time was the Gulf region, and now the Gulf region is also becoming more active against Wahhabism and other groups.
Okay. So just, again, you're putting a lot on the table, so I want to try to just kind of bring together a lot, because I think, one of the questions, and it's another question I want to pose to all of you and ask you to kind of put shorter reactions, and let's just kind of see what you think about it. But one of the main things that's often asked about, and I think we have a question here from Greg Gauss, in fact, is like, okay, well, where's the backlash, right? I mean, this is such a pivotal change in Saudi Arabia, as we're saying. Eman's talked about how in these earlier kind of iterations, there was always a resistance to these kinds of changes. Why are we not seeing that same backlash in Saudi Arabia? I think you've started to give us some indication of these kind of deeper reasons why there was a weakness, an underlying weakness at this point in the core of the sort of ideology as being the strong center of the state, whether it be through the fragmentation of Salafism, whether it be through the rise of jihadism and the kind of threat that posed, and how, both the states then, states, Western states, and also the states there started to see the problem and to react against it. Or as you said, especially the Gulf states and reacting against that. These are some of the reasons. But I wanted to hear from each of you exactly how you think, why don't we see a backlash, or how are we able to see this really pivotal change seemingly be taken sort of successfully right now? So Sultan.
The straightforward answer is that it is difficult to see a backlash in the same manner that we saw in 1990, is because that the state security is becoming more efficient and become more strong in terms of preventing any kind of collective action that threatens the state and the ability. In 2017, they were successful in terms of dismantling any kind of Islamist organization in the country. They monopolized the public spheres in terms of Twitter and etc. by heavily controlling the narrative and what is said in these spaces. And they also developed technologically in terms of their ability of detection and the targeting and arresting any kind of voice that challenges this narrative. So this is inside Saudi Arabia, but in generally, this kind of heavy-handed approach toward any kind of dissent created a phenomenon that is significant and is growing in numbers and in influence outside Saudi Arabia. That is the dissidents outside, and these dissidents who are spread in several countries in the world, they made and voiced some kind of challenge and criticism of this new laws, and their voices and criticism are also being consumed domestically through social media, but that I wouldn't go as far as say that it would create some kind of significant effect on state policies. But other than this backlash from abroad, I don't think that we should expect anything from inside. And this is also not because this is exclusively because of the heavy-handed and the police. And I think there are some segments, both in the elite and in youth, and they vote on this new narrative, and they think that this is a new narrative that represents what is now new Saudi Arabia should be. And some are happy about. For example, if you are a religious minority or a woman or a person from regions outside of Najd, then you would see this new narrative is more welcoming to you to be a member and participant into this new nationhood. Whereas in the previous narrative, it's only those who are either religious or males or people from Najd or Hijaz who would think that this kind of narrative would be appealing to them. In this new narrative, we see women heroes who fought against the Ottomans were celebrated. We see heroes from regions outside Najd are being celebrated. And Shia are the sectarianism that is embedded within Wahhabism now is being removed. In MBS interview with the Atlantic, it will be that was the first time I think I see a Saudi royal would celebrate Shia and Sunnis as being part of the religious outpost of Saudi Arabia. And this would be, people will think this is good, and this would be, if we compare between two not perfect political narrative, that would be more beneficial for certain segments within Saudi society, but that would upset also other segments who the ones with I think more power in the past, but these were weakened and attacked and pushed out of these hubs of power. I think this is my short answer, but if we want to extend it.
Yeah. Eman, can you speak a bit more about sort of, I guess the other question I get a lot, not as, the first question is, well, how are they able to achieve this, given the centrality of the, religious establishment and, religious enforcement and the rule of the kingdom. But the second is, what are they replacing it with? So, I asked you at first to talk a bit about moderate Islam. Can you actually give a little bit better idea of what that is, though? I mean, how you see the Saudi state stepping in with a new kind of framing of what Islam the Saudi state is promoting?
I think, and this is something I've mentioned in the paper, the moderate Islam debate started really a few years back, and I think mainly after 9/11. I thought it was really interesting to see how, the state was trying to promote this moderate Islam, but of course, because it was also discussed in the States, you can hear it at that time, it's very much discussed that we need to, Muslim societies need to adopt moderate Islam. So for them, even within members of the official religious establishment, they saw it as, being imposed on them. It's a Western concept. It's not, and there is no such thing as moderate Islam. So if we go back to the official religious establishment, some of their, very important sheikhs have actually mentioned that in their fatwas and so on. So at the beginning, it was, I think, the state's attempt. And then, of course, we have
about the United States.
No, the Saudi state. So it was the Saudi state's attempt to promote this, but of course it was seen at that time that it was mainly, something that was discussed in the United States as a reaction to the September 11th attack.
What is it? What is moderate Islam? Can you describe it?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because I don't think anyone knows exactly what is moderate Islam. It's quite an idea that you hear it a lot being proposed, but we've heard it for at least 20 years, and we haven't even seen what exactly. I think the issue is that there isn't really a real genuine work to present a counter discourse. We hear this phrase, but we don't see anything on the ground. Like Sultan said, I actually read the new textbooks. I read when they came out in 2019. I looked that there were so many changes in the history books and in the social science and citizenship textbooks, but the religious books were very much, they haven't changed much. So I think that needs to be tackled in order to have an understanding of what is this kind of, to what extent is religion is going to be part of this narrative. I think this is a tension that hasn't been solved yet, and it's definitely some work in progress, I would say. But I think it's very important to address that, because many of these modernization projects are clashing with this old religious interpretations that we find in textbooks, and also a religious vacuum. So moderate Islam is definitely, on the global stage, we see it as outreach to religious communities, outreach to Muslims in the diaspora, to make them able to live in, in their communities. But domestically speaking, I think we don't really have an answer for that yet.
Okay. So when you say outside communities living within their communities, you're saying that it's not so much about unifying sort of the Ummah in a concrete religious project, but instead Muslims should integrate and follow the laws that they find within each of their states.
Definitely. That's what I've seen or heard.
So it's part of this sort of new nationalism in a way that people should find their position within their existence.
Exactly. And Mohammed Al-Isa mentioned that a lot in his program. He said, you have to follow the country you live in, their laws, how they do things. You have to be part of that society. This is very different from what we used to, hear before. But, it's very important to present your, identity as a Muslim first and foremost, and then comes, the other maybe layers of, other layers of identity that would come along. But now we have a total different, hierarchy, I would say. But this is basically, and I think the textbooks are quite interesting. And going back to the backlash, I was actually in Saudi just last month, and it was really interesting to see how the different regions, as Sultan was talking about, are really reacting to change. There are places that are very much, they feel that as long as it hasn't really affected them so much, they really don't care. Riyadh is the place where everything is happening. And when I went there during the break, there were lots of domestic tourism, lots of people coming from outside Riyadh to see the Riyadh season. So that was quite interesting to see, and to see how people are really reacting to change. So I think there is optimism. There is a certain optimism to these, grand plans working out. At least that's what you see, and maybe this is why there is, as you said, there isn't this backlash. And as Sultan said, when it comes to the state's, overreach, you don't see any resentment on social media, definitely. So yeah, these are my points about this.
Okay. I want to switch to Hassan then and frame this in the question I was going to ask you. Sort of Umar Karim has written in and asked the same. And that is basically, do we see this demise of the influence of Wahhabism within Saudi statecraft will affect Saudi religious soft power? So, Eman was trying to kind of articulate what this new moderate Islam is, how it looks different, saying that it's not so clear, particularly when you put it within the context of the new Saudi Arabia that's also being presented in terms of all of these new entertainment and tourism and that kind of appeal. So how do you see the Saudis kind of unifying this new image of Saudi Arabia with the old outreach that Saudi Arabia used to have, where their Saudi statecraft was very much, and soft power was linked to this particular form of Islam, and its origins and kind of strength of being, the center, of course, of Mecca and Medina and the holy sites of Islam?
I don't think that changes quite a bit, but the answer is related to the question you asked before to Sultan Eman, which is the moderate Islam that Saudi is supposedly advocating. And I think the definition is more semantics, meaning when they talk about moderate Islam in the region, the meaning is different when it comes to from Saudi Arabia to UAE to Egypt, for example. In the case of Saudi, I think it's more like more of a negative, meaning they're rejecting extremist Islam, but they don't really know yet what moderate Islam means. So it's really about pushing back against these ideas and doing the effects of the Sahwa, as they say, right? Or the Islamic awakening in the 70s and 80s and before that and after that. So in that sense, I think it's more like we're rejecting, so it's more like a pushback for now. In the case of the UAE, for example, which has started earlier than Saudi, kind of advocating for this idea, and they have developed a network of scholars. So they haven't had really yet a UAE indigenous moderate Islam brand. It's more like networks with the likes of Sheikh Ben Baya from Mauritania, famous Maliki scholar, well respected, widely respected, and Ali Jeffrey, for example, Habib Ali Jeffrey, and others, and even networks with Azhari from Egypt. And these networks, they use them to sort of promote a version of moderate Islam that they think, which is kind of anti-extremist, but also Sufi and Ash'ari leaning brand of Islam. The Egyptian, obviously, and the Syrian and others, is more indigenous in the sense that there's an Ash'ari legacy that has been well entrenched in places like Egypt and Syria. Once you take away the Muslim Brotherhood effect, you're left with the indigenous brand of Islam that's well known. They have institutions like Al-Azhar, and in Syria they have other institutions. Same thing in Iraq and places like Libya and Tunisia. So in that sense, they're once they take over that effect of the Muslim Brotherhood, which Sisi seems to be doing, it's doing it systematically. You started to have more of you sort of know what moderate Islam, and I think Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, I kind of don't want to step over what the other panelists who know better about Saudi Arabia. I think it's, but judging from how other regimes have done it before, there is a period of time when you are so aggressive against groups like Wahhabism and Islamism, but there comes a time when they can switch back to saying they advocate an idea, and once that idea is developed. So Saudi Arabia, at some point in time, maybe in 10 years, in 5 years, they're going to go back to sort of moderate Islam, or more maybe a mainstream conservative Sunnism, and it's going to be a Sunnism of sort, mixed in some elements of Islamism with some elements of Salafism, but it's not Wahhabism, it's not Muslim Brotherhood. I think that moment would come. Like I said before, there's a transition across the region, and we don't know what's going to happen after, but there has to be some sort of ideology endorsed and embraced by these states. It's not going to just, I think it's going to happen after they take away and undo the effects of Islamism that has dominated the region over the past few decades.
Yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, I know, Eman, you go into much more detail in your paper, looking at kind of Muhammad Al-Isa's project, looking at the television show he has, the kind of international scholars, Islamic scholars that he invites, and the kind of messaging that they do. And I know that there are plans to establish a Hadith Center. I think it's already established, actually, in Medina, which is supposed to have an international board of scholars connected to it. So it'll be interesting to see if Saudi Arabia goes more in the direction that you're talking about, Hassan, that the UAE does, where they also have, an international board of scholars to kind of start to regulate a new approach to Islam. I don't know if you want to speak on that, Sultan, but we also have a question from Vivian. I thought it'd be Vivian Nareem in Saudi Arabia. I thought would be interesting for you to answer. That talks about this element of the founding day, where they were encouraging citizens to dress up in costumes inspired by traditional dress from different regions. So this kind of new regionalism, I know that's something that you've been especially interested in your research as well. How does this sort of fit in with the overall New Saudi project? And the debate that kind of ensued from that.
Yeah, I think this is this celebration of regional diversity and regional clothing and cultural, and try to reificate cultural, regional cultural symbols and make them more visible and celebrated. I think this is driven by two policies by the government. The first one has to do with this cultural and national changes of narrative and history, etc. And the other one is.
What do you mean by the cultural and natural?
Yeah,
national change?
What
do you mean by that?
I mean, this shift that we are talking about in terms of moving away from this story about this is a religious and conservative and Wahhabi country to a country that it is mostly and foremost is about the territory that it occupies, and it's about the regions that it successfully brought together, and these regions now are allowed and encouraged to celebrate their. To be sure, this celebration of regional diversity has been around since the late 80s, as Eman said in Al-Janadriya. And in Janadriya festival, this is a festival sponsored by the Saudi National Guard every year, where each region comes and it has their own corner in Riyadh, that they celebrate their own distinctive regional and cultural differences. But what happens in the last few years is that this celebration was taken to another scale, another level, and this is so this was driven part by this changes in terms of what is the Saudi nation and what is now the Saudi states signifies, and another is mostly economic, because now the Saudis in 2015 they try to rebrand themselves in terms of to be a tourist attraction, a tourist destination, and part of transforming a country into to be a tourist attraction is to create this places where tourists can come and see the authentic and organic culture. But these authentic and the organic culture are being manufactured and reproduced and fixed in order to become spectator for foreigners and tourists to be to enjoy and experience in a kind of in this sense or another. Whereas in the past there was a heavy push toward assimilation. There are laws, for example, that any Saudi who wants to have anything to do with any kind of a government office, they are not allowed to enter government buildings if they don't wear the Saudi national dress, which is mainly an HD national dress. If you are wearing a imama or wearing other than the traditional Saudi dress, then you are not allowed to enter, and you will face. But now this has been changed in this diversity, and the diversity is not about only regions. It's to include also sectarian and gender issues. Women are being now celebrated and being promoted into senior positions in the country. And also last year, when the Shia, they have this Ashura commemoration every year. Then in the past, normally they were allowed to do it in silence, and sometimes if they try to have it in a very public manner, then the government would push them to commemorate the death of Hussein in a more private spaces. But in last year, even during COVID, and where mosques are not allowed to congregate, the social influencers and Twitter, they celebrated this. It's not a celebration; it's more for a commemoration. So they allowed for this to be seen and publicly recognized by the state. And this is something new. And I think these things are allowed within this frame that that citizenship or membership to Saudi nationhood is mainly driven by being economically active, having a more entrepreneurial mindset, being successful in terms of being in terms of being tolerant socially, culturally, being loyal plus global oriented in terms of being able to consume the global cultural main trends, etc. And this is being done on the expense of being a political subject, in terms of that political participation, political activism, any kind of political activities has to be eliminated entirely from. Whereas in the past, the Saudis were allowed to be politically active in arenas, especially with issues has to do outside Saudi Arabia, for example, Palestine, Afghanistan, Bosnia. So the Saudis are allowed to be actively participants in these kind of causes. But now any kind of transnationalism is perceived as to be threatening, especially with the impact of two important stuff. As I said in the beginning of this panel, when King Salman gave this lecture in 2011, he adopted the same a narrative that the Saudis always keep repeating about the relationship between Wahhabism and Saudi state. Now, 10 years later, we see a change in this subject. And I think the main two events that influence this kind of changes, in addition to the intellectual work that I've talked about, are Arab Spring and the rise of ISIS. These two events made it clear for the Saudi state that transnational Islam, either in the form of Wahhabism or Muslim Brotherhood, constitute some kind of an existing threat, and creating and going into a very risky route of establishing a new nationhood that it is more confined within the borders of the Saudi state. This is a very risky approach because it costs a lot. It costs you to get rid of all the assets that you have been accumulated through the past decades, all the education and that you've that you created some kind of citizens that internalize this narrative. And then you go ahead against all of that, I think that has to be driven by a perception of some kind of an existing threat. And I think the rise of ISIS and Arab Spring are the main events that cause this kind of change. And before that, Salman is famous. When he was governor of Riyadh, is famous of being the most supportive among the Saudi royals of Wahhabism. I remember we were planning to publish a book in 2014 about Wahhabism, when ISIS rose, and there was all this discussion about ISIS and Wahhabism and Salafism, etc. And I collected several Saudi intellectuals, and since we are Saudis and Wahhabism came from Saudi Arabia, it is better for us to publish a book about this. And then King Abdullah died and King Salman became king. And most of my colleagues who were planning to write a book, they said, no, we can't write about Wahhabism now because Salman became king, and Salman is a fierce supporter of Wahhabism. And then we are surprised to see that this guy who is the most supportive of Wahhabism in the past is the one who is now getting rid of it and making it disappear in terms of as a political man.
But I think at the same time, I mean, you can see King Salman through his long position as the governor of Riyadh as well, though was an early sponsor of Daraiya, the revival of that project, of kind of centering Saudi identity on this sort of new national identity as well, the national identity that's promoted underneath Al Saud. So I think, you know, as we're seeing, there's a lot of different contradictions in the different approaches that we have to see are linked to these global events too, in these changes. But I think some of that we can see along the planning as well.
I would add something here. If you look into the first blueprints of Daraiya when it was designed in late 90s, mid 90s, early 2000s, you would see there will be a mosque and a mosque of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and a museum about Muhammad Abdul Wahhab.
Yeah, I've written about
that. So yeah, and in 2015, this disappeared. So so even when they want to craft a heavy focused Saudi citizenship after the Gulf War, the Wahhabism was part of the story. But the decision of removing it, that is, I think, a recent one.
Yeah. We can see that very much differently in the 2017 when we have the new iteration of the Daraiya Gate Authority and just more developmental kind of projects. That is very much linked to this global approach. So I want to get to more questions because we're running shorter on time. This one I think you started to answer, Sultan, but we'll see if maybe Eman can add to it too. Helen Lackner talks about the discussion is focused on Wahhabism versus moderate Islam, but has not addressed the issue of the rise of nationalism and the emergence of Foundation Day as a nationalist response to a primary of Islam as defining characteristic of Saudi Arabia. So what kind of nationalism with which non-Muslim characteristics is likely to develop in coming years? And I think you started to talk about some of those features of the new nationalism and how it's promoted within Saudi Arabia and some of its features that are not Islamic especially I think, Eman, you've written about the Saudi, or I've written about it actually, and you can talk about it too, the Saudi character program and some of these other kind of characteristics that are wrapped up with the new Saudi promotion of nationalism. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, sure. Actually, just to mention, there is a very nice workshop that the Arab Gulf State Institute have made maybe in 2017, where you talk about citizenship across the Gulf. And that really gives very nice examples on the Emirati case, for example, because of course, 90% of Emiratis or the population of the Emirates is non-Emiratis. So they've done, I think, a very smart or a very good job at trying to address that, how to be a citizen, even if you're not, or how to have this kind of approach to the country if you're not part of it, how to appreciate the Emirates even if you're not from there. And I think that was a very interesting example to look at in the case of the Emirates, because in Saudi, and going back to the textbooks, I've written a piece on the textbooks on 2019, and I talk about this, what is the expectations of a citizen, in Saudi Arabia, or, what is the expectations of people under this new nationalism. And there are so many different, they actually, and sometimes I think in the 4th grade, they actually go into details. And it's quite one of the, I don't really remember all of the points that I wrote about, but it's for the Arab Gulf. But one of them is basically trying to really find out the source of information and to see if it's fake news or not fake news. And it's very important to know before you circulate information in social media. So there are, when it comes to expectations of citizens and so on, there are some very concrete examples in the textbooks about that. So but if we're looking at other symbols, I think I don't think there are many, but when I wrote about this in the hyper-nationalism piece, they're of course trying to promote this kind of nationalism through different means, of course through the youth and the reference of Jebel al-Dwayq, and the idea that the Saudi youth is as powerful as these mountains and so on. So there are some references here and there, but I think it's as I mentioned, when it comes to religion and so on, it is still, work in progress. We see things pop up every now and then, but it hasn't been as detailed, I will say, as the Emirati case, who really, as Hassan also said, they're way ahead in that, race.
There is this idea, though, about sort of a functional citizen and how they should be more efficient, how they should approach work, how they should be more positive in their outlook, how they should present themselves. It's more of a kind of professionalism that's preparing sort of Saudis for the market, which I think is very interesting. And that's part of the tension that I see, is that on some level, there's some idea of a kind of replacement of what Saudi Islam might look like. But there's another element, which is just what we should be doing actually, is just preparing Saudis, young Saudis under this new nationalist program to, kind of take their future into their own hands in terms of their productiveness and this sort of thing. And that's a different kind of character and values that are being promoted. That's, kind of completely separate from an Islamic approach. Which is interesting to see in Saudi Arabia. So there's some tension, which one is going to be the more important one. And that's linked to what Sultan talked about, is this new kind of global economic approach and the integration into the global economy and what Saudis can contribute to that. I wanted just to mention, we were talking about kind of nationalism, and just to balance it out, because we're talking about Saudi Arabia, but it is worth, and we noted the comparison that you can make with the UAE, but there was an interesting tweet from Dr. Marwa Mazid, who's been writing on this too, and I just wanted to kind of call her out and thank her for that she's written on the shift and the change in the National Day in Qatar, which also shifted its National Day back to celebrate its founding in 1878, which was a similar move, kind of making it linked to the early kind of Qatari kind of leadership. So I think it is worth noting that this is a change that we're seeing across the Gulf, and not just in Saudi Arabia, which kind of speaks to this need for more national origins and that are trying to root more strongly in these national ruling families. Let me see. Let me ask a question that's written here. Maybe Hassan, you're best to answer this one from Ger Pierboom. What is going to be the role of the holy cities then? Eman said that tourism and religious tourism is still extremely important to the Saudi kingdom, but do you see some role change in this pivotal role of the Saudi leaders as found, as basically the supporters of these two holy cities that has critical standing for all Muslims?
So as I think I mentioned, hinted to it before, I don't think the Saudi state is under any pressure to change or walk back or have, make any change to that. The two holy cities will always be significant to Muslims, including to Saudi enemies, let's say geopolitical enemies like the Iranians and the Taliban and other forces in the region. So I don't see that changing. Again, we're seeing something else at play now, which is that people, maybe Islamists across the region, see the Saudi state as their enemy, and therefore they're uncomfortable at they're not. It's not easy for them to go and visit Saudi Arabia, for example. So that is, that's a very particular problem, and I think whether you're talking about like from, it's a kind of I don't think that will make a big difference for the Saudis. So I think, like I said, the most interesting thing is how long the Saudi authorities will continue with this policy of, or how long it takes them essentially to feel that they have pacified the forces that they see, as Sultan again said, as existential enemies to them, whether you're talking about Wahhabism or Islamism and other forces. And that once they feel secure and comfortable, they need there's a passage of time with experience. They're going to be able to mold a new ideology. They can shape a new ideology that sort of fits and aligns with their policy. And I think that will happen at some point, because it happened with other regimes in the region, like this Bashar al-Assad. It's an Alawite-led regime, but they are now advocating a very particular brand of Sunni Islam. And Sisi, advocating secular Egypt and so on and so forth, but he's also embracing a very particular brand of Sunni Islam. And I think the Saudis are not going to be an exception to that. They're going to be advocating and embracing a sort of a very particular brand of Sunni Islam, like I said, that presents Saudi as a kind of the custodian of Islam and all that. I don't think that's going to change. It will just take time for them to do it.
Can we ask about some of the other changes? There's a lot of questions here. Sorry, I just lost one. We've talked, Sultan, you've talked about changes that are happening with women being more inclusive. Do you think women will be allowed, Jamil Khan is asking, will women be allowed to become religious scholars and to lead prayers in mosques? Are we leading in that direction? There's another question too about alcohol too. When will alcohol be allowed in Saudi Arabia? So kind of looking at the some of these key areas that were, of course, not allowed previously in Saudi Arabia. Do you see these kinds of changes taking place?
As with regard to women being incorporated into religious establishment, that has been happening now. I think they announced something about women would be recruited as qadis, as judges. I think something like that. And in terms of being imams and masjid, I think this is the difficult. I think nowhere in the Muslim world women are allowed to be imams in masjid. In masjid where both male and females attend. In only female mosque, females are leading the prayers. This is happening in Saudi Arabia from AGSIW. For example, in girls' schools in Saudi, there is a female leader of the prayer. But in a gender mixed situation, I don't think that would don't expect it. But with regard to alcohol, I think this question has to do with pressure for opening up for tourists. And there are rumors, I don't know, I don't have any inside information, but there are rumors that they will allow it in a similar manner of how Qataris allow alcohol in hotels for only foreigners. And we see the legal ground for that has been paved in terms of differentiating between laws based on religion. For example, in the new personal status laws that was just announced, we see that Islam is only applied for Muslims, and non-Muslims are dealt with different legal apparatus. And I think that would be the basis for allowing non-Muslims, i.e. non-Saudis, to be allowed to consume alcohol, and this would be justified based on Sharia, because in the past, in earlier Islamic empires, Christians and Jews are allowed to drink alcohol within Muslim cities and towns, and that would be used as a justification for this laws. Other than that, I don't have any, and actually I don't think this is a big issue. I don't care if they allow that.
Well, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to use that to just ask each of you to sort of look forward and see how you see this overall project kind of moving into the future. We have a lot of questions that came from people saying, do we expect a backlash? Do we expect kind of a resurgence of Wahhabism? I think Hassan, you already kind of gave tipped your hat on that one and saying you don't see that happening. But I wanted to see give you the opportunity to see moving forward how you see this more nationalist center project kind of succeeding, or if you see kind of challenges ahead. So why don't we start with you, Hassan?
Yeah, I see that trend. I mean, also Wahhabism has evolved over time. So it's not like they're going to go back to the 18th century or 20th century or 19th century. There has been already progression, and we're seeing a new phase of Wahhabism, and that Wahhabism diet, if you like, is not going to be, is already changing. It's already drastically changing. So I don't think there is a resurgence in that sense. Also, the irony is that Wahhabism emphasized the loyalty to the ruler, and the ruler saying basically that's over for you, so you have to obey the ruler. That's over for them, right? Essentially, and they have to. I don't think they're going to be a resistance from that. Now, the question is obviously the other movements that came out of Wahhabism, influenced by Wahhabism, how they're going to react and how they see that. That's where. But generally speaking, it's beyond Saudi Arabia, beyond Wahhabism. I think there are sweeping changes in the region, and all of them indicate that those brands of ideologies and Islamic movement, Islamism that dominated the region, and that regimes didn't pay attention in an organized and an intentional manner before, are declining. What's coming out after that is really an open question.
Okay. Eman, you suggested earlier that you thought that there's quite a bit of support for this new kind of union that they're finding within Saudi Arabia. Is that then you see this kind of moving forward in a positive direction?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting when we talk about this, where are the direction, where are they going now? And I think I agree with what also Hassan said, it's all a work in the making, or, work in progress, but something is definitely coming to happen. But I think, sometimes we talk about, are they moving towards secularizing, or, I don't honestly think that's going to be the case. I think I expect to see some trial balloons, as we've seen in the past, where we hear something, mentioned in the social media about, adopting this or, abandoning that. So it's going to be a period of this where we hear these kind of, ideas being proposed. Maybe we hear some backlash on social media. Maybe we see something new proposed again. So it's definitely these coming years, I think, would be quite interesting to see how it will progress and hopefully, develop and we see it as in real life.
Sultan, I wanted to ask you, I know a lot of people that I talk to say they see things kind of well in control and the direction of where things are headed right now, but maybe in 10 years, the economy is more challenging. Of course, we don't know right now, the economy is looking pretty good in Saudi Arabia, so maybe that's not the issue right now. But do you see kind of a more bumpy road for this ahead? Do you see a revival of some of the old kind of, a return to some of the old ideological formations, or do you see that that's kind of finished for now, and the kind of nationalist approach is going to be the one that wins the day?
I think the break that it's a done deal, and there is no way that the Saudi state will return to its Wahhabi legitimization tactics or strategies unless something happened to the leadership in Saudi Arabia. But if the leadership remains as it is, then we don't think, and we'd expect that the leadership will continue to be for the foreseeable future, and that would continue to be. I just want to make some caveats here. The first, when we say that Wahhabism is dead as a political myth, that doesn't mean Wahhabism as a religious tradition lost its significance. As Hassan said, it still will remain, will continue to be taught and engaged with in terms. But what we mean by Wahhabism here is a specific thing. It's this story that there is two leaders come together and made this comeback. The second thing I want to say is that
the political story, the political
story
is the central political origin story for Saudi Arabia is finished.
Yeah, that's what is being, and also there is also normal people when they speak about Wahhabism, they conflate it with Salafism, etc. And in Saudi Arabia, Wahhabism has a specific meaning. It's the religious tradition accumulated by a network of scholars, Najdi scholars, who contributed to this and that influenced the judicial system and the religious output of the country. And this body of literature, as Hassan said, evolved over time and changed, and then made changes too. And I think that body of literature will also cease to be relevant in Saudi Arabia, especially in judicial part. The third aspect, that doesn't mean religion will be outside of the Saudi story. It will be there, but it will play. The Saudi state still presents itself as a state that applies Sharia, but Sharia in a very minimalist and understanding, and this will be so it's moved from. I wouldn't put it as a movement from religious to secular state, but a movement from a maximal religious state to a minimal religious state, and that would describe it in a very accurate way.
Okay. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. I want to thank all of you for a very rich discussion. I think there are a lot of threads left out there that we didn't get to pick up on, but we will be having this video. It will be available in the future. So I hope that we can all, look to this, and it'll kind of promote some more thinking about the Saudi state and its direction. And really grateful to have you here, and for all of you who have been joining us. Thank you for your questions and your engagement, and we'll look forward to further engagement on this topic.